The gavel came down so hard that the sound cracked through the courthouse like a rifle shot, and Birdie Bailey did not flinch. I said enough. Judge Harlan Cobb's face had gone the color of a boiled beet, his thick white mustache trembling with the effort of containing whatever rage had taken hold beneath that black robe. This court will not entertain the ramblings of a schoolteacher who fancies herself a lawyer. Case is dismissed. You haven't seen the ledger. Birdie's voice was steady. It was the kind of steady that comes not from an absence of feeling, but from an excess of it. Every emotion so precisely controlled that the result was something that looked like ice and burned like fire. She stood in the center of the courtroom in Caldwell, Kansas, on the 14th day of October in 1882, and she held the leather-bound ledger against her chest like a shield. Judge Cobb, if this court dismisses without hearing the financial evidence, 14 families lose their land by Friday. Dismissed means dismissed, Miss Bailey. He pointed the gavel at her like it was a pistol. If you open your mouth one more time, I will have Marshal Dunn remove you from these premises and hold you on contempt charges. The courtroom was full. Ranchers and their wives, farmhands, a few merchants who had come to watch what everyone in Comanche County had been calling the trial of the generation. Donovan Marsh sat on the defendant's side with his attorney and 2 of his hired men, and he was smiling. He had been smiling since the moment Birdie walked in, and that smile told her everything she needed to know about the nature of Judge Cobb's ruling before the ruling had even been given. It was a bought smile. It belonged to a bought judge, and the evidence she was holding proved both of those things in numbers and signatures that could not be argued away. Birdie looked at that smile for one long moment. Then she looked down at the ledger. Then she looked up at the gallery where Ralph Hadley sat in the 3rd row with his hat in his hands, watching her with dark eyes that held something she did not have time to examine right now. She picked up her satchel from the defendant's table, tucked the ledger inside it with the rest of her documents, and walked out of the courthouse without another word. The autumn air hit her face like cold water, and she stood on the top step for exactly 3 seconds, breathing, counting, organizing what came next. Because there was always a next. That was the thing about Birdie Bailey that most people in Caldwell, Kansas had not yet understood. She did not stop. She adapted. She had 48 hours before Donovan Marsh's fraudulent land claims were legally finalized. She had a ledger that documented every bribe, every forged deed transfer, every falsified boundary survey going back 6 years. She had a judge who refused to look at it. She had a governor who might. She just had to get the evidence to Topeka before Friday morning. The footsteps behind her on the courthouse steps were heavy and measured, the kind that belonged to a man who knew where he was going, and she did not need to turn around to know who they belonged to. Miss Bailey. Ralph Hadley's voice was low and unhurried, the way a deep river is unhurried, moving with a power it doesn't need to advertise. You got a plan, or are you just breathing real deliberate until one comes to you? She turned then. He was taller than she remembered, which was strange because she had seen him every day for the past 3 weeks in the context of this case, helping to gather statements from the dispossessed families, riding out to survey the contested boundary lines. But something about the October light, and the immediate weight of what had just happened in that courtroom, made her see him clearly in a way she hadn't allowed herself before. He was 31 years old, rangy and broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that comes from a decade of working cattle and open sky. He had a straight jaw and a mouth that looked like it didn't smile easily but meant it when it did. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has quietly decided matters to him. I have a plan, Birdie said. I need to write a letter tonight and I need it on the early train to Topeka tomorrow morning. What kind of letter? She met his eyes. The kind addressed to Governor Charles Robinson that contains every piece of evidence Judge Cobb just refused to look at. Ralph Hadley was quiet for a moment. Then you think the governor will actually act on it? I think he has to. Not because he's necessarily a better man than Cobb, but because the land grab Marsh is running affects the railroad tax base, and Robinson can read a balance sheet as well as anyone." She shifted the satchel on her shoulder. "I also think that if a schoolteacher from Caldwell sends documented evidence of judicial corruption directly to the state capitol, and the governor ignores it, then whoever runs against him next year will have a very interesting piece of campaign material." Ralph looked at her for another moment with that particular expression, the one she had been cataloging since the first time she'd seen it, which was somewhere between respect and something more unguarded that he seemed to be actively trying to keep from showing. Then he nodded once, like a decision had been made. "Then let's get you somewhere you can write it." That was how it had begun, in a sense. But it had really begun 6 weeks earlier, on the first day of September, when Birdie Bailey had arrived in Caldwell with a teaching contract, and a past she intended to leave in St. Louis. She had been 27 years old, and she had been a teacher for 5 years, and she had been, without fully realizing it, waiting for something that she could not have named. Not a man, not exactly, or not just a man. Something more like a purpose that was large enough to hold all of her, all the parts that did not fit neatly into the role that women were expected to inhabit in 1882. Caldwell was a cattle town on the edge of the Cherokee Strip, and it was growing fast, which meant it was also growing complicated. New settlers were pushing south into land that had been in the hands of established ranchers for 20 years, and the established ranchers were not all happy about it. More to the point, Donovan Marsh, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and had for the better part of a decade been quietly acquiring land through means that were never fully explained, had taken to using the confusion of the expansion to press fraudulent claims against small homesteaders who did not have the legal sophistication to fight him. Birdie had known none of this when she arrived. She had known only that the schoolhouse was a one-room building with a leaking roof and 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 16, and that the previous teacher had left after a single semester without explanation. She found out why within the first week. 3 of her students were the children of families whose land was currently contested by Marsh, and when she asked after one girl's father, who had been absent from the harvest festival that the school had organized, the girl told her in a flat, careful voice that her father had been served with papers that said he didn't own his land anymore, and that they might have to leave before winter. The girl was 10 years old. Her name was Nell Carver. Her handwriting was meticulous, and her arithmetic was exceptional, and she had told Birdie this terrible fact with the practiced composure of someone who had already cried about it privately, and decided that crying in public was not useful. Birdie recognized something of herself in that composure. She stayed after school that day, and she asked Nell to tell her everything she knew. It was more than a child should have known. It was also more than enough to make Birdie understand that something seriously wrong was happening in Comanche County. And then she started asking questions of the other families, and she started getting answers, and then she started looking for the paper trail. She found it in the county clerk's office, in records that were technically public but practically inaccessible, because they were organized in a way that required either extensive patience or an understanding of land recording systems that most settlers simply didn't have. Birdie had both. She had grown up watching her father, a St. Louis attorney, navigate legal documents, and she had spent 5 years teaching older children enough reading and arithmetic to begin understanding the world that was going to claim them, and the combination of those two things had given her a particular skill with documents. She found the first anomaly on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-September. A deed transfer dated 3 years prior, showing a parcel of Carver land changing hands from Abel Carver to Donovan Marsh for a consideration of $40, which was approximately a tenth of its market value even in a bad year. The signature on Abel Carver's line looked wrong. She took out the statement she had collected from Carver himself, and she compared the signatures, and they were not the same signature written by the same hand. They were not even close. That was when she knew what she was looking at. That was also the day she met Ralph Hadley. He had come into the county clerk's office on entirely different business, checking a boundary survey for a piece of land he was considering purchasing on the southern edge of the county, and he had found Birdie Bailey standing at the records counter with a magnifying glass and two documents spread open before her, so absorbed in her comparison that she hadn't heard the door. He had stood and watched her for a moment, not because he was trying to be surreptitious, but because something about the picture stopped him. She was a small woman, not in the sense of being fragile but in the sense of being compact, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a gray hat and green eyes that behind the magnifying glass looked enormous and sharp as glass. She was wearing a practical wool dress with ink stains on the right cuff that suggested she was not concerned about ink stains. She was comparing two signatures with the focused concentration of someone who had done this before, or at least someone who had the natural talent for it. "Those don't match," Ralph said. She looked up. She did not startle. Her eyes found him with a flat, measuring look, and she said, "No, they don't. And I'd appreciate you not mentioning to anyone that you saw them side by side. Not yet." He liked that, the directness of it, the assumption that he was someone worth being direct with. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Evidence of fraud," she said. "Possibly the largest land fraud Comanche County has seen. I'm Birdie Bailey. I teach school." "Ralph Hadley. I run cattle on the Hadley spread north of town." He crossed the room and looked at the documents she was holding. She tilted them so he could see. He studied the signatures for a moment, the slight but unmistakable difference in the pressure and slope of the letters, and said, "You're right. That's not the same hand." "I know." "Do you know whose hand it is?" "Not yet, but I'll find out." She folded the documents with careful hands and tucked them back into the file she'd brought in. "Are you a man who knows how to keep information to himself, Mr. Hadley?" He considered the question seriously, which she noticed. "I've been known to." "Then I may want to talk with you later, after I've had time to think about what I'm looking at." That had been their beginning. Not dramatic, not romantic in any obvious sense. Just two people in a county clerk's office, with a shared recognition that something important was happening and that it needed to be addressed. But it planted something between them that grew slowly over the following weeks, in the way that things grown slowly are often the strongest. Over the course of September and into October, Birdie built her case. She was methodical and precise in the way that people with genuinely superior analytical minds are methodical, not rigidly but intelligently, understanding when to follow a thread and when to set it down and approach from a different angle. She identified 6 separate instances of forged signatures across 9 parcels of land. She found 3 deed transfers that had been recorded on dates when the county recorder's office was officially closed, meaning they had been slipped into the record by someone with a key, which narrowed the field of possible co-conspirators considerably. She found, buried in 3 years of payment records from the Caldwell Municipal Bank, a series of deposits into an account held by one Harlan Cobb, corresponding in amount and timing to the dates on which Marsh had successfully prosecuted disputed land claims. That was the ledger. That was the piece of evidence that mattered most, and getting access to it had required Birdie to spend 11 days cultivating a relationship with the bank's head bookkeeper, a nervous young man named Oliver Petty who knew what the deposits meant and was terrified of what knowing meant for him. Ralph Hadley had helped with Oliver Petty, not by threatening him, which would have been counterproductive and was not in Ralph's nature anyway, but by being present in the conversations Birdie had with him, sitting across the table in the back room of the Caldwell Hotel with his long arms folded and his expression neutral, in a way that made Oliver Petty feel that there was something solid in the room, something that would not move if pressed. It was a quality Ralph had that Birdie had begun to notice more specifically, a kind of physical steadiness that was not the same as aggression, but communicated something similar, a dependability at the level of bone and muscle that went beyond mere size. Oliver Petty gave them the ledger copies on a Thursday evening in late September. He was shaking when he handed the documents over, and Birdie had looked at him and said, "You're doing the right thing. The record of your cooperation will be part of what goes to the authorities, and that matters." "Will it keep me safe?" he asked. "It will matter," she said, which was the honest answer. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. That was another thing Ralph had noticed about her. He had been noticing things about her for 3 weeks by then, accumulating them quietly the way a man accumulates a conviction before he knows he's doing it. The way she had with documents, which was not just intelligence but something almost artistic, a craftsperson's pride in doing precise work. The way she was with the dispossessed families, warm and practical at once, never condescending but never pretending the situation was less serious than it was. The way she was with him, specifically, direct and unguarded in a way that assumed equality before it was offered, which was unusual enough in his experience to feel remarkable. He had also noticed, with some discomfort, that she was beautiful in a way that had not been immediately apparent because she kept it so firmly behind the practical, focused presence she presented to the world. And the discomfort was not because he didn't want to notice, but because he was aware that his noticing it was something he had not entirely resolved in terms of its appropriateness given the work they were doing together. He had resolved, sometime around the evening with Oliver Petty, to let the work continue as it was and see what happened after. It was not a sophisticated plan, but it was an honest one. After the courthouse disaster, after Birdie stood on the steps and Ralph offered to help her get somewhere she could write, they went to the schoolhouse. It was where she had all her materials, and it was where she spent most of her evenings anyway, either grading work or continuing her research by the light of 2 oil lamps. He'd come by often enough that the walk there together felt natural, felt like something they had always done. Inside, Birdie set the satchel on her desk and unpacked the ledger and the supporting documents with the calm efficiency of a surgeon laying out instruments. Then she sat down and pulled a sheet of writing paper from the drawer and dipped her pen and began to write. Ralph sat in one of the student chairs near the door, which was comically small for him, and he did not speak because he understood that she was working. He watched her write, the swift, clean movement of her hand across the paper, and he thought about what she had done in that courtroom. Not the failure of it, because it had not really been a failure in the way that mattered, but the fact of it. The fact of a woman standing in front of a corrupt judge with a ledger full of evidence and refusing to be moved when the gavel came down. The fact of the steadiness in her voice. She wrote for 2 hours. It was a long letter, detailed and precise, and she did not write it as a plea. She wrote it as a report. She enumerated the evidence with the clarity of someone who understood that emotional appeals are easier to dismiss than documented fact, and she organized the documentation as referenced exhibits, and she wrote with the kind of authoritative confidence that comes from being absolutely certain of your material. When she was done, she read it through twice, made 4 small corrections, and set down her pen. "Done," she said. "Can I read it?" She slid it across the desk. He leaned forward in the small chair and read it carefully, all 6 pages, and when he was finished, he set it down and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something open and slightly undone. "Birdie," he said, this is exactly right. Everything is there. Every number, every cross-reference, every date. It's as good as a brief from any lawyer I've ever seen." "My father was an attorney," she said. "I grew up reading his work. I know how evidence is supposed to be organized." He was quiet for a moment, still looking at her. Then, "Who taught you the forgery analysis, the signature comparison?" She smiled, just slightly. "My father again. He had a case when I was 14 involving disputed wills, and he brought his documents home and showed me what to look for. I never forgot. It's a remarkable skill." "It's a necessary one," she said. "In this world, in this time, the things that protect people are not fists or firearms. They're records and legal documentation. If I can read a document the way you can read a trail, then I have a weapon that most people don't see coming." He stared at her. And in that moment, sitting in a small chair in a schoolhouse in Caldwell, Kansas, Ralph Hadley felt something shift in him that he was fairly confident was not going to shift back. "We need to get that on the first train tomorrow morning," he said, because he had to say something practical or he was going to say something else entirely. "I know. The eastbound leaves at 7:45. I'll need to have this packaged and addressed before then." She began to carefully fold the letter around the documents. "I also need to send a telegram to a newspaper." He frowned. "Which newspaper?" "The Topeka Daily Capital." She looked up at him. "The letter to the governor is the formal legal action. The telegram to the newspaper is the insurance policy. If the governor knows there's a journalist aware that he received this evidence, he has less room to quietly make it disappear." Ralph stared at her again. "That is, you've thought of everything." "I've thought of what I can think of. There are things I haven't thought of, I'm sure." She paused, holding the folded letter. "For instance, I haven't thought of what Marsh will do when he realizes I've gone over the judge's head. I haven't thought of that because I don't want to slow myself down thinking about it right now." "I have thought about it," Ralph said. "That's why I'm not leaving." The words settled into the room, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I didn't ask you to stay," Birdie said, but she said it quietly without the edge that the words might have carried. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she read documents, carefully and without preconception. Then she set the letter down and said, "The cot in the back room is for the nights I fall asleep working. You can't sleep in that chair, it's made for a 12-year-old. I'll be fine." "Ralph," he looked at her. "Thank you," she said, simply. No performance of emotion, but genuine. The kind of thank you that costs something. He nodded once and settled back in the chair. He was awake all night, not from discomfort but from awareness of her presence in the room. The soft sound of her breathing after she finally stopped working, the quality of the dark around them, and the strange peaceful feeling that came with all of it that he had not felt in a very long time and had not been expecting to feel tonight of all nights. The morning broke cold and clear, and they walked to the telegraph office together before the sun was fully over the horizon. Birdie drafted the telegram to the Topeka Daily Capital in 5 minutes, concise and factual and perfectly worded, and the operator took it with a slightly wide-eyed look at the contents before she reminded him that his job was to send messages, not to evaluate them. Then they went to the train station. Ralph stood with her on the platform, and she held the envelope with the governor's letter, and there was a moment while they waited for the train, in the early October cold with the sky going gold and pink in the east, where the weight of everything they had done over the past week seemed to settle in the air between them. "What happens to you if this doesn't work?" he asked. She thought about that for a moment. "I lose my teaching position, most likely. Marsh has enough influence that he could make sure of that. I'll have to find another position somewhere else." She paused. "What happens to you?" "I'm a rancher. My land is paid for and clear. Marsh doesn't have a claim on anything I own." He looked at her profile. "I'll be fine." "Then why did you stay up all night in a 12-year-old's chair?" He was quiet for a moment. The train was coming, the sound of it building from the east, the iron smell of steam beginning to mix with the prairie air. "Because," he said, "I find that I have developed a significant interest in what happens to you, Miss Bailey. And sitting in an uncomfortable chair in your vicinity seemed preferable to the alternative." She turned and looked at him, and something in her face that was usually carefully composed had come slightly undone at the corners. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way morning light comes through a crack before it opens up the whole room. "That is a very careful way of saying something," she said. "I'm a careful man." The train pulled in. She handed the envelope to the conductor personally, watching his hands close around it, and she told him it was time-sensitive correspondence for the governor's office in Topeka, and that it should be treated accordingly. The conductor, who was used to being given things by people who told him they were important, nevertheless responded to the quiet authority in her voice with a nod that was more respectful than routine. They watched the train leave. The platform emptied. The morning was very still. "Now we wait," Birdie said. "How long?" The train gets to Topeka this evening. If the governor's office is responsive, I might hear something by Thursday. She picked up her bag. I have school this morning. He turned to look at her. You have school? 14 children who depend on me to show up, yes. She tilted her head. Donovan Marsh is not going to derail my students' education, in addition to everything else. Come find me at the schoolhouse at 4 o'clock if you want to talk about next steps. He watched her walk away down the platform, straight-backed and purposeful, and he stood there for a moment just watching and thinking about the fact that he had been in the company of a great many women in his 31 years, and had never felt quite this particular combination of admiration and helplessness and warmth, and that it was, under the circumstances, genuinely inconvenient. He went to find breakfast, and then he went to check on some of the affected families, because there were practical things to be done regardless of what was happening in Topeka. The Carver place was the first stop. Abel Carver was a broad, quiet man in his mid-40s who had homesteaded his land with his wife Maria 12 years ago and built something worth protecting. He was out mending fence when Ralph rode up, and his face when he saw Ralph was careful with hope and dread in equal measure. Any news from the courthouse? Abel asked. Ralph told him about the dismissal and about Birdie's letter to the governor. He was honest about it because Abel Carver deserved honesty. The man listened without interrupting, nodded slowly, and said, "You trust Miss Bailey's judgment on this?" "I do," Ralph said, and the ease with which he said it surprised him a little. Abel looked at him for a moment. "She came out here last week, sat with Maria and talked through the whole thing for 2 hours. Maria doesn't trust easily, and she trusts that woman." He paused. Said she reminded her of a marshal she knew in Missouri, the one who was honest. Said it was the same look in the eyes. Ralph thought about Birdie's eyes behind the magnifying glass on the first day he'd seen her. "That's accurate," he said. He spent the morning visiting 3 more families, and everywhere he went the report was the same combination of fear, and something that he came to realize was specifically attached to Birdie Bailey's presence in their situation. A cautious but genuine confidence that someone with real skill and real commitment was fighting for them. It made him feel both proud and something more complicated, which was an awareness of how much the outcome of the next few days would mean not just legally but to real people's lives, and how much Birdie was carrying on behalf of all of them. He was back at the schoolhouse at 4 o'clock precisely. He could hear her through the window before he knocked, the clear, measured voice of a teacher wrapping up a lesson, asking questions, waiting patiently for answers, and the quieter but audible voices of children responding. When the last child left, carrying a reading primer and a piece of bread that Birdie had produced from somewhere, because apparently she fed students who arrived hungry and did not make a production of it, Ralph went in. She was at the blackboard, erasing equations. She had chalk dust on her cheek and a pencil stuck in her hair, and she looked entirely at home, which was interesting given that she had arrived here less than 2 months ago. Some people carry their home inside them, Ralph thought. They don't need long to make a new place familiar because they bring the essential quality of it with them. He had not thought in those terms before. He found that being around Birdie Bailey made him think in terms he had not previously used. "Anything from Topeka?" he asked. "Not yet. Tomorrow, possibly." She set down the eraser and turned to face him. "Marsh sent 2 men to the school this morning." Ralph went still. "What?" "Not to threaten anyone." They stood across the street for 20 minutes and then left, but the message was clear enough. She was calm about it, but he knew the calm by now, knew it was the controlled version of something that was not actually calm underneath. "He wants me to know he's watching." Did it frighten the children? The fact that this was his first question told her something. One of the older boys noticed and told me afterward. "I handled it." "How?" "I wrote down the time and the descriptions of both men in my log. I told the boy that keeping accurate records of events is the best response to intimidation, and I showed him how to do it." She paused. "His name is James Whitmore. He's 14. His family's land is one of the 9 parcels Marsh is contesting." Ralph sat down in the teacher's chair because the student chairs were truly too small. "Birdie, are you all right?" The question seemed to catch her slightly off guard. She looked at him and he watched her think about whether to give the practical answer or the real one, and she chose, in what he suspected was a significant departure from her usual practice, the real one. "I'm frightened," she said. "I have been since the judge came down on the gavel this morning. Not of Marsh's men standing in the street specifically. Of the possibility that I've done everything I can do and it isn't enough, and the Carver family and the Whitmore family and the others are going to lose their land anyway because the system that's supposed to protect them is in someone's pocket." He did not try to tell her it would be fine, because she would not have believed it and he would not have believed it either, and she deserved better than comfort that was not built on anything solid. "You've done everything a person can do," he said. "The rest is outside your hands. What's in your hands is that letter, and everything in it is right. I read it myself." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Why do you keep coming back?" "Told you this morning. You told me you had a significant interest in what happens to me. I'm asking you to be less careful." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the schoolhouse window, the afternoon was going orange and long-shadowed, the prairie stretching out to a horizon that looked close enough to touch. "I have not met anyone like you," he said finally. "In the way of thinking about it, I have met brave people and I have met smart people, and I have met people who were stubborn in useful ways. You are all of those things and something else that I don't have an accurate word for. Something about the way you carry yourself when the ground is shifting under everyone's feet. Something about the way you treat every person you talk to as though their situation matters specifically and not in general." He stopped. "I keep coming back because leaving is not something I'm able to do with any kind of comfort." She was very still, looking at him. The chalk dust was on her cheek and the pencil was in her hair, and she was the most compelling person he had ever been in a room with. "I came to Caldwell to do a job," she said. "I didn't come here to need anyone." "No. But you came here to do something important, and you have done it. And I think that doing important things sometimes changes what you came for." The silence between them was not empty. It was the specific silence that happens when something has been said that both people recognize as true and that neither is quite ready to move past yet. Then Birdie said quietly, "I grew up in a house full of books and arguments and legal principles, and I left it to go teach because I wanted to be useful in a direct way to individual people, children who needed what I could give them. I have been alone in that work for 5 years. Not unhappily alone, but alone." She paused. "Having someone who shows up and reads the letter and stays in the uncomfortable chair is not something I knew I was missing, and now that I've experienced it, I find that I am aware of its absence on the occasions when it's not present." It was the most careful admission he had ever heard, and it was perfectly Birdie, and it made something in his chest do something complicated. He stood up from the teacher's chair and crossed the room and stood close to her, close enough that he could see the exact shade of her eyes, which were green in the way that October light through leaves is green, complex and shifting. "I would like," he said very carefully, "to make the case that its absence need not be frequent." She looked at him for a moment that felt very long and very important. Then she said, "That is still very careful. I am trying to respect your autonomy and your independence and your right to have arrived at this moment entirely on your own terms. I appreciate that." She reached up and removed the pencil from her hair in what seemed like a purposeful gesture. "You may be less careful now." He kissed her. It was a straightforward, honest kiss, the kind that means what it means, and she responded with the same quality of honesty that she brought to everything else she did, and when they pulled apart they were both very quiet for a moment. "Well," Birdie said. "Well," Ralph agreed. Outside the schoolhouse window, the prairie had gone golden under the setting sun, the last of the October light burning on the tall grass like something that intended to be beautiful before it went out. The telegram came the next day. It arrived at the school at 10:30 in the morning, brought by the telegraph office boy who had been told it was urgent. Birdie read it at her desk while her students worked on arithmetic problems, and she read it twice, And then she set it face down on the desk and returned to the front of the room and continued the lesson with the expression that Ralph had come to recognize as the one she wore when she was carrying important information and had not yet decided how to process it. When the children went to lunch, Ralph was there. He had taken to appearing at the schoolhouse at convenient times, because apparently he had no more capacity to stay away than he'd had since the night of the letter, and she had taken to not commenting on it because apparently she was no longer interested in pretending she didn't welcome it. "The telegram," he said. She handed it to him. He read it. It was from the governor's private secretary, a man named Harrison Crew. It said, "Governor Robinson has received your correspondence and the accompanying documentation. He has referred the matter to the State Attorney General's office for review. You will be contacted. In the meantime, please ensure your evidence is secured." Ralph read it twice. "The Attorney General. That's better than I hoped for," Birdie said. "The governor could have dismissed the correspondence or sat on it. Referring it to the Attorney General means it's been taken seriously enough to formalize." "How long does that process take?" "Depending on the AG's caseload and the political will, anywhere from 1 week to several months." She paused. "But there's a deadline. Marsh's land claims are being finalized Friday. I need to get an injunction before then." "Can the Attorney General issue one?" "Not directly, but a letter from the AG's office to the district court would carry weight that Cobb couldn't ignore." "Even a bought judge understands when the wind has shifted." She looked at him. "I need to send another letter, this one to the AG's office directly, outlining the urgency of the timeline." "Write it," he said. "I'll take it to the telegraph office myself." She looked at him for a moment with that slightly open expression she had, the one that appeared when he did something that she had not braced for. Then she sat down and picked up her pen. The letter to the AG took an hour. It was even more precise than the first, because she was working against time now, and precision was her sharpest instrument. She cross-referenced the Friday deadline with the specific land claims, outlined the legal standard for emergency injunctive relief under Kansas property law, and closed with a sentence that Ralph, reading over her shoulder, thought was the finest legal sentence he had ever read by someone who was not technically a lawyer. "The irreversible harm that will accrue by Friday morning in the absence of immediate relief is not merely economic, but constitutes a fundamental violation of the property rights guaranteed by the homestead legislation under which these families settled, and this office has both the authority and the obligation to prevent it." "Did you just write that from memory?" he asked. "More or less," she said. She didn't say it with pride. She said it the way a skilled craftsperson reports a fact about their work. "I read law on my own time. My father discouraged it not because he disapproved but because he felt the legal profession would not treat me well. He was right. So I did what was available to me and I used the knowledge where I could." Ralph was quiet for a moment. He had known for some time that Birdie Bailey was exceptional. But he found that the layers of it kept revealing themselves in ways that stopped him, like a trail that keeps opening into new country. "Your father sounds like a good man who had a complicated understanding of what the world would let you do," he said. "That is an extremely accurate description of him." She folded the letter. "He died 2 years ago. Influenza. The house in St. Louis felt very empty after that, which is part of why I left." He took the letter from her hands and covered them briefly with his own before he let go. She looked at his hands for a moment before she looked at his face. Something in her expression was unguarded in the way it only got when she was tired enough to let her careful composure slip, or when he had done something that touched a real place. "I'll be back by 2, he said. He was back by 1:30. The telegram had gone. The response, if it came, would take at least several hours. He came back to the schoolhouse and sat in the uncomfortable chair and watched Birdie teach her afternoon lessons and thought about what she had said about being alone for 5 years and what it had cost her and what it would mean to not be any more. At 3 o'clock, the telegram came back. It was from a man named Gerald Foster, deputy to the Kansas Attorney General, and it said, "Evidence reviewed." Emergency relief being considered. Injunction application submitted to district court. Clerk has been notified. Cobb expected to receive order no later than Thursday noon. Birdie read it standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse. Then she read it again. Then she looked up and out at the afternoon sky over Caldwell, Kansas, at the pale October blue of it, and something moved across her face that she did not try to contain. Ralph was behind her. He saw it happen, the very slight trembling in her jaw, the brightness in her eyes that she blinked clear, the breath she took that was too deep to be ordinary breathing. He stepped up beside her and did not say anything. She did not need him to. She needed someone to stand next to her while she allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel what she had been controlling for 6 weeks. Then she folded the telegram, tucked it into her pocket, and said, "I should check on the Carver family." "I'll come with you," he said. "I thought you might," she said, and there was something in her voice that was warm in a way that made the October air feel less cold. They rode out to the Carver place in the late afternoon, and when Birdie told Abel and Maria Carver that an injunction was coming, and that their land was protected at least through the legal process, Maria Carver sat down at her kitchen table and put her face in her hands and was very quiet for a long moment. Nell, the 10-year-old with the meticulous handwriting, looked at Birdie with an expression of careful, wondering trust and said, "Does this mean we're staying?" "It means you have a very good chance of staying," Birdie said. "I'm not going to promise more than I can deliver, but I'll tell you that the chance is real and the people fighting for it are serious." Nell nodded with the composure of someone who had decided to be brave. Then she said, "Miss Bailey, will you still be our teacher?" Birdie looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I will." Abel Carver shook Ralph's hand and then, to Ralph's slight surprise, shook Birdie's hand as well, firmly and with the kind of directness that communicated real respect. She shook it back. On the ride home in the blue dusk of the October evening, with the horses walking slowly along the river road, Ralph said, "She asked if you'd still be her teacher." "Yes." "What did it mean to you, that question?" Birdie was quiet for a moment, looking at the last light on the river. "It meant that she has invested trust in me and wants to know whether that investment is safe, which is the same question children ask in general and adults ask less honestly." She paused. "I told her yes because it's true." "I'm staying." Ralph looked at her. "Staying in Caldwell. Staying in Caldwell." She met his eyes briefly. "Is that of interest to you?" "It is of considerable interest to me," he said, "as you are fully aware." She smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that changed her whole face, and he thought he had never seen anything quite as worth waiting for as that smile. Thursday came, and with it a long morning of waiting. Birdie taught her morning classes with her usual precision, but Ralph noticed the way she glanced toward the window every 20 minutes. He was there, in the uncomfortable chair that he had essentially claimed as his own, ostensibly reviewing paperwork for his own ranch business, but actually just being present, which he had concluded was the most useful thing he could do. At 11:47 in the morning, Marshall Dunn appeared at the door of the schoolhouse. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, who had been wearing the marshal's badge in Caldwell for 8 years, and who, Birdie had noted early on, was one of the few law enforcement figures in the county who had not been visibly compromised by Marsh's money. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "Miss Bailey, I have been instructed by the court clerk to inform you that Judge Cobb received the AG's order this morning, and that the injunction on all 9 contested parcels is in effect pending the Attorney General's full review." The classroom was very quiet. The children, who ranged from 6 to 16 and had all grown up in a community where this case had been the overriding anxiety of the adult world, understood something significant had happened. The older ones understood it exactly. Birdie set down her piece of chalk. "Thank you, Marshall Dunn. When is the AG's full review expected?" 3 to 4 weeks, I'm told. "And in the meantime, no transfers or claims can be finalized?" "None. The court clerk's been so instructed." "Thank you." She turned back to the class. James Whitmore, the 14-year-old from the Whitmore family whose land was among the 9 parcels, was sitting in the middle row with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes bright. He was not crying because he was 14 and had decided not to, but it was a near thing. "All right," Birdie said in a voice that was very steady. "Back to our lesson." We were discussing fractions. Ralph watched from the back of the room, and he felt something in his chest that he thought was happiness in its purest and simplest form. The Attorney General's investigation over the following weeks was thorough and consequential. Gerald Foster came to Caldwell personally, bringing 2 investigators from the AG's office, and he spent 5 days going through the evidence Birdie had assembled. She met with him for 3 hours on the first day, and provided him with every document she had collected, organized, indexed, and cross-referenced in a way that made his 2 investigators look at each other with expressions of professional admiration. "You organized all of this yourself?" Foster asked her. "Yes," she said. He looked at the document index she had created. "This is better than most of the case files I receive from county sheriffs. I had time and a magnifying glass," she said, "and a clear understanding of what needed to be proven." Ralph was at that meeting. He had been invited by Birdie, not as a legal representative but as a witness who had been present for the gathering of certain evidence. He watched Birdie present her case to Foster, and he watched Foster's expression move from professional neutrality to something that looked a great deal like being impressed. And he felt a warmth that was specifically territorial and specifically uncomplicated, that he was pleased to find in himself. Over the course of the investigation, Donovan Marsh became increasingly agitated. He had, Ralph heard from various reliable sources, attempted twice to reach the AG's office through back channels, and had been referred, both times, to the formal process. He had also attempted to convince Judge Cobb to do something, though what exactly remained unclear, since Cobb was now being very careful about anything that could be interpreted as interference with a state investigation. One evening during the 3rd week of the investigation, Ralph was riding back from the Hadley ranch when he encountered 2 men on the road who were not from Caldwell and had the look of men who had been hired for something specific. They did not do anything overt. They rode past him without speaking, but he recognized the type, the flat-eyed professional indifference of men who had traded their personal ethics for a day rate, and he took a longer route back to town and went directly to the schoolhouse. Birdie was there, naturally. She was grading arithmetic papers by lamplight, and she had a cold cup of coffee at her elbow that had been forgotten. She looked up when he came in and read something in his face immediately. "What happened?" she said. He told her about the 2 men. He told her calmly and factually without dramatizing it, because dramatizing it would not help and she would see through it anyway. She was quiet for a moment, turning a pencil end over end in her fingers. Then she said, "He's running out of options through legitimate channels. That makes him more dangerous, not less." "I know. I think for the next few weeks you should not be alone on the roads at night." He raised an eyebrow. "I was going to say the same thing to you." She looked at him. "I'm serious, Ralph." "So am I, Birdie." He sat down across from her. "We can be serious about each other's safety simultaneously. It's not a competition." Something in her expression shifted, that particular soft cracking at the composure she maintained like professional armor. "I'm not accustomed to someone being serious about my safety." "I know," he said. "I can tell. I'm also not particularly interested in changing that habit in a way that makes you feel managed or constrained. I just want to be the person who knows where you are." She looked at him for a long moment with those clear, complicated green eyes. Then she said, "I think I am falling in love with you." The directness of it, the complete absence of hedging or performance, was the most Birdie thing she had ever said, which was saying a great deal. He sat across from her in the lamplight and felt the words land in him the way true things land, with a weight that is not a burden. "I know," he said. "I can tell, and then, I am fairly certain that I have already arrived at that destination for what it's worth." "When?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "I think the night you wrote the letter to the governor." "Watching you write it, watching you be certain in your work." He paused. "When did you start?" She considered it with the same honesty. When you read Oliver Petty's ledger and your first question was whether the families would be safe, not whether there was money in the case, most men would have asked about the financial angle first. Most men, he said, are not in love with you. No, she agreed, they are not. The investigation concluded in the second week of November. Gerald Foster's final report to the Attorney General documented 11 counts of fraud, 3 counts of forgery, and 1 count of bribery of a sitting judge against Donovan Marsh, along with 2 counts against Judge Harlan Cobb personally. The report was submitted to the governor's office with a recommendation for prosecution, and Governor Robinson, aware that the Topeka Daily Capital had been following the case since Birdie's initial telegram and would be watching the outcome, moved swiftly. Marsh was arrested on a Tuesday morning by 2 state marshals who arrived in Caldwell on the overnight train. He was taken to Topeka for arraignment. His hired men, including the 2 Ralph had encountered on the road, dispersed without direction once their employer was in custody. Cobb resigned from the bench before the week was out, and a temporary appointment was made to handle the county's legal matters while a permanent replacement was found. The 9 contested land parcels were returned to their rightful owners within 2 weeks. The fraudulent deed transfers were voided, and the original recordings were restored. Abel Carver got his land back. The Whitmore family got their land back. All 9 families got their land back. On the morning that the final legal restoration was confirmed, Birdie was teaching class as usual. She did not make an announcement to the children. She simply wrote 2 words on the blackboard in her clear, precise hand, next to the arithmetic problem she had already posted: land secured. James Whitmore in the middle row read it and was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to the arithmetic problem. His hands were steady. After school, Ralph came, and Birdie was standing on the step outside the schoolhouse door in the November air, which had gone cold and sharp and smelled of approaching winter. She was looking at the street, at the ordinary afternoon of Caldwell going about its business, and she was thinking thoughts he could not read. He stood beside her. She was very quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I need to say something." "Say it," he said. "I came here to teach school. That was the whole plan. A clean start in a new place, doing work that I understood and valued, not needing anything outside of it." She paused. "And then I found the forged signature and I built the case and I fought it through to the end, and I am proud of that, and it was worth it regardless of what happened between us." She looked at him. "But what happened between us is also something I would not trade, and I want to be clear that those 2 things are separate and both real. I am not grateful to you for what you are to me. I chose it, the same way I chose to fight the case." He understood exactly what she was saying. He understood it because it was the most important thing he had ever heard anyone say to him: the assertion of agency within love, the insistence on being a choosing person and not a rescued one. "Birdie," he said, "I know. I want to make sure you know." "I know," he said again, and put his hand against her face, his thumb gentle against her cheekbone, and she leaned into it the way someone leans into something they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with your full understanding that properly means at whatever pace and in whatever form you find appropriate." She looked at him with something that was nearly but not quite a smile. "And if I find a traditional courtship appropriate, then I will acquire a very clean hat and call on you at suitable hours. And if I find it appropriate to move faster than traditional, then I will keep pace, because I have absolutely no desire to be anywhere but where you are." The smile arrived fully then. It transformed her face the way it always did, opening up something that she kept carefully contained otherwise, and it was as remarkable to him in November as it had been the first time he'd seen it in October. They were married in December. It was a small wedding, the way both of them preferred, in the church on Caldwell's Main Street on a Saturday afternoon, when the first snow of the season was coming down outside in soft, unhurried flakes. The minister was a straightforward man named Pastor Allen who had known Ralph for years and who had taken an immediate liking to Birdie the one time he'd met her, which he had told Ralph was the endorsement that mattered. The guests were the families Birdie had fought for, because it seemed right to have them there. Abel and Maria Carver sat in the front pew with their children, including Nell, who wore her best dress and held a small bunch of dried wildflowers she had brought herself. The Whitmore family came. 5 other families came. Oliver Petty from the bank came, looking slightly less nervous than he had been for the past 2 months, which was progress. Marshall Dunn came and stood in the back with his hat in his hands. Birdie wore a dress the color of winter sky, a deep blue-gray that she had made herself over the previous 2 weeks in the evenings after school, and she walked down the aisle without anyone giving her away because, as she had explained to Pastor Allen when he asked, she was not being transferred from one keeping to another. She was arriving on her own terms. Pastor Allen, after a moment's thought, had said that seemed right. Ralph stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him, and the expression on his face was one that no one who was present that day ever quite forgot. A completely unguarded openness that was remarkable on a man who was known for being measured and contained. He looked at her the way you look at something that you cannot fully believe, and that is better than anything you would have known to want. She reached him and looked up at him and said, quietly, just to him, "Are you all right?" "I am extremely all right," he said. The ceremony was brief and honest. They said their vows with the same quality of directness they had always brought to each other, and when it was done and Ralph kissed his bride, the small congregation in the church on Caldwell's Main Street applauded with a warmth that had something particular in it, the warmth of people who have been through something together and come out the other side. Nell Carver threw the dried wildflowers. That first winter was one of the best of Ralph Hadley's life, and he had had some good winters. The ranch was running well. The cattle had come through the autumn roundup in good condition, and the house, which had been comfortable before, became something more under the influence of Birdie's presence. Not because she changed it dramatically. She was not a woman who rearranged things for the sake of rearranging them, but because there was now someone in it whose intelligence and humor and warmth filled the rooms in a way that Ralph found himself unable to adequately describe except as the difference between a house and a home. She continued teaching. That had never been in question. The school board, which had been somewhat apprehensive about what the case and its aftermath might mean for the stability of the school, found that the community's trust in Birdie had only grown, and her contract was renewed without discussion. She was a remarkable teacher. Ralph understood this in part from the accounts of the children and their parents, but also from watching her, because she had taken to working at the large table in the ranch house's main room in the evenings, rather than staying late at the school, and he would look up from his own work and watch her plan lessons with the same systematic intelligence she had brought to building the legal case. She treated the children's education the way she had treated the evidence, as something that required precision and care, and a genuine belief that it mattered. She also, he discovered over the course of that winter, had a sense of humor that was dry and deeply funny, and had been somewhat suppressed during the intense weeks of the legal battle. She was funny in the way that very intelligent people are funny, unexpectedly and specifically, and the first time she made him laugh with a well-timed observation about the absurdity of the county tax records, he laughed until his sides hurt, and she watched him with a delighted expression and said, "I was beginning to think I was the only one who found that genuinely funny." "You have been holding back," he said. "I have been preoccupied," she said. "You can stop now." "I intend to," she said. The spring brought news that Donovan Marsh had been convicted on 3 of the 11 fraud counts and sentenced to 8 years in the state penitentiary. Judge Cobb, in a separate proceeding, was convicted of judicial corruption and barred from the bench permanently, receiving a suspended sentence due to his age. It was not perfect justice. Ralph and Birdie agreed when they read the accounts in the Topeka Daily Capital, but it was something real, and it was more than the families who had lost, and then recovered their land had dared to hope for 6 months earlier. Birdie sent a letter to Gerald Foster at the AG's office thanking him for the investigation. He wrote back, a long and formal letter that contained, near the end, a sentence that she read aloud to Ralph over breakfast. Miss Bailey, now Mrs. Hadley, I wish to note for the record that the quality of the evidence you assembled and the manner in which you organized and presented it was instrumental in making this prosecution possible, and that the state of Kansas owes you a debt of gratitude that it will likely be too formal to express officially, but that I am happy to express on its behalf. Ralph looked at her after she finished reading it. She was looking at the letter with an expression that was composed but not entirely still, the brightness in her eyes again. "He's right," Ralph said. "I know," she said. Then she folded the letter and put it in the cedar box where she kept the documents she intended to keep, and she poured more coffee and said, "What are you doing today?" "Riding out to check the north fence. Do you want to come this afternoon? The bluebells are starting along the river." She looked at him with the smile that was still, every time, remarkable. Yes. In the summer, Birdie discovered she was expecting. She told Ralph on a Tuesday evening in June, sitting on the porch of the ranch house with the long prairie summer light gold around them. And she told him with the same directness she brought to everything, but with a particular softness in it that she did not try to hide, because it was genuinely soft and she had stopped pretending with him. He was quiet for a long moment after she told him. Then he looked at her with an expression that she catalogued with the careful, loving attention she had come to apply to his face, which was one of her favorite things to look at in the world. The expression was a complicated and beautiful one, compounded of joy and something slightly frightened and a great deal of tenderness. "Are you all right?" she asked, echoing their wedding day. "I am extremely all right," he said, and took her hand. The baby came in February, a boy heavy and loud and determined from the first moment, with his father's dark eyes and everyone agreed his mother's expression of focused assessment. They named him Robert after Birdie's father. Robert Hadley came into the world during a snowstorm, delivered by the town doctor with Ralph waiting outside the bedroom door in the way that was customary, which was to say in a state of controlled terror that Birdie, between contractions, had told him through the closed door was entirely understandable, and that she was fine. He had said, through the door, that he was very glad to hear it. She had said, through the door, that she would discuss the accuracy of that assessment with him after the baby arrived. He had made a sound that was not quite a laugh. When the doctor opened the door and told him he had a son, Ralph went into the room and sat beside Birdie, who was holding the baby with the practical, careful competence she brought to everything, and looked at both of them for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For what specifically?" "For arriving in Caldwell, for finding the forged signature, for writing the letter, for all of it." She looked down at the baby, who was making the considered, slightly outraged face that newborns make when they are deciding what to do with the world they've arrived in. "Thank you for staying in the uncomfortable chair," she said. He leaned in and kissed her temple, and she turned her face slightly toward him, and outside the ranch house window the Kansas winter lay deep and white and still all the way to a horizon that had never looked more like the beginning of something. The years that followed were full ones. Robert grew up sturdy and curious, with his mother's analytical mind and his father's steadiness, and he was followed 2 years later by a sister named Clara, who had Birdie's auburn hair and a personality that announced itself at high volume from the very beginning. Ralph once observed that Clara had inherited her mother's conviction in the rightness of her positions, but had not yet developed the discipline to express it at conversational volume, and Birdie had said that seemed developmentally appropriate for a 2-year-old and also somewhat familiar, and Ralph had been unable to identify what she meant by that until she produced the letter she had written to the governor, which she had always kept in the cedar box, and pointed out that the tone in the opening paragraph was not entirely unlike Clara's approach to wanting something. He read the letter. He read the opening paragraph. He said, "That is completely different," she said. "Read it again." He read it again. He laughed until his sides hurt, which she watched with the delighted expression she always had when she genuinely got him. The school in Caldwell grew over those years, the student population expanding with the town, and Birdie became not just its teacher but its architect in a broader sense, arguing successfully to the school board for a larger building, trained resources, and eventually a second teacher for the lower grades, so that she could give the older students the kind of secondary education that most frontier children never had access to. She continued to bring the same systematic intelligence to it that she had brought to the legal case, because Birdie Bailey did not distinguish between her important work and her other important work. Everything she did was done with the full weight of her attention and ability. James Whitmore, the 14-year-old who had recorded the descriptions of Marsh's hired men in his notebook on Birdie's instruction, went to study law in Topeka when he was 18, citing Birdie as the reason. He wrote her a letter from law school that she kept in the cedar box alongside the governor's correspondence, and in it he said that watching her build the case against Marsh had taught him more about the practice of law than any book he'd read since. She wrote back and told him to read everything he could get his hands on and to never mistake confidence for certainty, which he later said was the best legal advice he ever received. Nell Carver, who had grown up on the land her father almost lost, became a teacher herself, which Birdie said was entirely Nell's own decision, and which Ralph said was the highest compliment Birdie could have been paid without knowing it, and Birdie said that was a very generous interpretation that she was choosing to accept. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, Ralph and Birdie sat on the porch of the ranch house in the December dark, which was cold enough to require blankets and close proximity, and they could hear Robert inside pretending to be asleep and Clara actually asleep, the different quality of silence from each of them audible through the window. "Tell me something," Ralph said. "What? Tell me something you haven't told me yet." She thought about it seriously because she took the question seriously. It was one of the things he had always done with her, asked for the parts she kept carefully stored, not because he needed to collect them but because he wanted her to know they were welcome. "I was terrified the morning I sent the letter," she said. "More terrified than I let myself feel at the time, not of Marsh or of the consequences. Terrified that it wouldn't be enough, that I would do everything right and it would not be enough because the world does not reliably reward doing things right." "But it was," he said. "It was," she agreed. "That time, and I know enough to know it isn't always." She paused. "I think about Nell's father, about the year those families lived with the possibility of losing everything. I think about what it costs people to be at the mercy of systems that are supposed to protect them and don't. And I think about the fact that the only thing that changed it in the end was a magnifying glass and 6 weeks of documentation and a letter that went around the system that was failing them." "And a schoolteacher who wouldn't stop," Ralph said. "She was quiet for a moment. And a rancher who stayed in the chair." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, which was something she had learned to do without thinking about it, and which he had learned to make room for without comment. And the two things together constituted the kind of ease that is only built by time and trust, and many evenings of being honest with each other in the cold dark. The stars over the Kansas prairie were very bright that night, the way they get in December when the air is clear and cold, and the distance between the earth and everything above it feels exact and important. Ralph and Birdie sat under them and were quiet and warm together in the way that people are quiet and warm when they are in exactly the right place with exactly the right person and they know it. Somewhere inside the house, Robert turned over in his sleep and muttered something that was probably about horses, which was his current preoccupation. Clara made a small sound and was quiet again. Birdie said, "I think I would like another one." Ralph looked at her. "Another child. In a year or two." "When Clara is a bit older. How many are you thinking?" She considered it with characteristic precision. 4 seems like a number that is ambitious but achievable. He laughed the real laugh, the one she could still produce in him so easily that it delighted her every time. Ambitious but achievable, you are applying case-building methodology to family planning. I apply systematic thinking to everything, she said. You knew this when you married me. I did, he said. It is one of the many reasons I married you. Name the others, she said, which was a game they had been playing since the first winter, asking each other for specific answers when general ones would be easier, refusing to accept the comfortable shorthand of long-established closeness as a substitute for actually saying things. He thought about it genuinely, looking at her in the December dark, at the woman who had stood in a courthouse with a ledger against her chest and refused to be moved, who had written a letter that changed 14 families' lives, who had taught a generation of children that their minds were their most important asset, who had looked at him across a schoolroom and decided on her own terms to love him. The way you read documents, he said. The magnifying glass on the first day. The letter. The way you are with Nell. The way you explain to Oliver Petty that his cooperation mattered. The way you make the chair in the corner of the ranch house feel like the best seat in any room. The way you told me you were falling in love with me with the same directness you'd use to report a finding in a case. He paused. The way you look right now. She looked at him for a long moment. The prairie was very dark and very large around them, the whole of the Kansas winter lying open and enormous and full of stars. And the ranch house behind them was warm with sleeping children, and the smell of the fire they'd banked before coming outside. And it was 5 years after a courthouse gavel came down too hard on a case that deserved to be heard. And Birdie Bailey, who was Birdie Hadley now, but who had never stopped being Birdie Bailey in all the ways that mattered, looked at the man beside her with the full, unguarded clarity of someone who has nothing left to keep carefully stored away. I love you, she said. Simply, without decoration, the way she had always said the things that were most true. I know, he said. I can tell, and then, I love you too, in ways I could not have expected and could not do without. She leaned up and kissed him in the cold dark, and the stars over Kansas went on being enormous and precise and beautiful overhead, and the prairie stretched out in all directions into the winter night, and inside the house the children slept, and the cedar box on the shelf held the governor's letter and James Whitmore's letter from law school and the documents from the AG's office and all the rest of it. The paper record of a schoolteacher who had built a case and sent it over the head of a corrupt judge directly to the state capitol and changed something real about the world, because she would not accept that the world's failures were permanent. And none of it, not the letter or the case or the land that had been saved or the judge who had been brought down or the families who had kept what was theirs, none of it was the most important thing that had come out of that autumn in Caldwell. The most important thing was something that could not be filed in a cedar box or cited in a legal brief, something that had been built in the space between two people who had found in each other exactly the kind of partnership that neither had known how to name before they were living in the middle of it. It was something that looked like a woman standing on courthouse steps in October, organizing what came next, and a man coming down the steps behind her and asking if she had a plan, and the fact that she said yes, and the fact that he believed her, and the fact that they had been saying yes to each other and believing each other in the daily particular way of real people ever since. The fire inside the ranch house burned low and steady. The stars went on being enormous. Birdie and Ralph sat together in the December dark for a long time before going in, and when they did, they went in together, closing the door quietly against the cold, and the night settled over the Kansas prairie in the year 1887 with the peaceful weight of everything that had been resolved and everything that had been built, and the future was very large and very clear and entirely open, in the way that futures are when they have been fought for honestly and shared with the right person. There were no more outstanding questions. There was nothing left undone. There was only the warm house and the sleeping children and the man and the woman who had found each other in the middle of the most important fight either of them had ever been in, and had never looked back.